Welcome to today's webinar, the 10 Hiring Manager Roadblocks and How to Overcome Them. I'm Katie Williams from Glassdoor, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. So this event today is brought to you by Greenhouse and Glassdoor, together joining up in partnership. And before I introduce our speakers from Greenhouse and Glassdoor, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. So all lines are going to be muted for everyone on the phone, so please type your questions that you have throughout the presentation in the question and answer pane on the right hand of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. We'll make sure that we leave around 10 to 15 minutes at the end so you guys can all get those questions answered. Also, we'll be sending out the presentation and the recording after the webinar, so be sure you look out for that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers with some really great content today. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Caitlin Wilterding. She's the lead recruiter at Greenhouse, and she actually joined Greenhouse in October 2014 as employer number 42. And before Greenhouse, she managed technical and product recruiting for Conductor, Inc., another high-growth New York City-based startup, and she tried and failed to learn how to code and instead spends her free time figuring out how to greenhouse and greenhouse. And other free time activities include hosting bar trivia, which sounds kind of fun, marathon training, and conquering an acute fear of flying. We also have Dina Rulli on the line. She's, oops, sounds like I'm getting a little feedback, but let me make sure everyone's muted. Dina is Manager of Talent Acquisition for Glassdoor's Global Sales Recruiting Team, and she's also a key contributor to the employer branding strategy and social recruiting channel. And in her free time from recruiting, she actually has a food blog where she whips up healthy and tasty gluten-free food, which sounds amazing. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to have Caitlin take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you.
And so to get us started, I thought it would be a good idea to just run through an agenda. That way we know what we're going to be talking about today. So first, what we're going to do for everyone on the phone is define the problem. We're going to go through some common behavior. Dina's going to tackle that section. We're going to talk a little bit about the goal, right, which is ultimately creating hiring manager alignment. We're going to go over some 10 common roadblocks that I'm sure most people have experienced. We're going to go over some solutions, and we're going to tie everything together with some questions at the end. And so to kick things off, I think most folks here would agree that the most important person in your recruiting process isn't us, right? It's not the recruiter. And it's not your candidate either. The most important person in the process is your hiring manager. And that's because hiring managers hold the power to prioritize hiring, they define the person you're going to hire, and they ultimately make the decision to hire the person you have worked so hard to find. For this next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Dina to talk a little bit about some of the common behaviors we see with hiring managers and recruiters.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And you are 100% correct. If your hiring manager is not engaged, ultimately you won't be successful as a recruiter. So let's talk about some of the behaviors that we might be seeing displayed commonly by hiring managers and recruiters. So first up, the hiring manager. My hiring manager gives me impossible roles to fill. My hiring manager ignores my emails. My hiring manager doesn't give me feedback. My hiring manager doesn't know how to interview. My hiring manager doesn't tell their team what he or she is looking for. My hiring manager expects me to do all of the work. Or my hiring manager is blaming recruiting when their team misses project deadlines. And then moving on to the recruiter, my recruiter doesn't communicate with me. My recruiter doesn't provide enough information. My recruiter doesn't find me the right people. My recruiter takes too long to find candidates. My recruiter expects me to do too many interviews. And I mean, really, is recruiting so hard? Probably my favorite from this list. And so passing it back over to you, Caitlin, to talk about misunderstandings.
Yeah, so I'm giggling because all those things are also things I've experienced. But I think from the behaviors we just talked about, we can all agree that misunderstanding, mistrust, and miscommunication, these aren't the best ways to build a partnership with your hiring manager. And ultimately, that's how you create alignment with them. You build a partnership with your hiring managers. In order to do this, you have to build trust, communicate often, and make sure you understand each other. And you're probably thinking, yeah, right. I've tried all of these and nothing is working. And yeah, you're all right. I mean, building these three things is really hard. So what we're going to talk about next is how do we fix this? And we're going to go over some of the 10 common hiring manager roadblocks that Dina and I have identified. And we're going to go over our solutions for fixing them. So problem number 1, hiring managers don't prioritize hiring. And some common behaviors that we see is your hiring manager comes up and says, I need to cancel my interviews this week in order to meet a deadline. They'll say, why can't you, the recruiter, write the job description? Isn't that part of your job? And one of my favorites is, I'll review those resumes next week. 3 things that we can commonly see from hiring managers. So some solutions to solving this to actually get hiring managers to prioritize hiring. The first one is give hiring managers some tough love. Don't open the role. One of the things that we do here at Greenhouse is we actually have kickoff meetings. And before a role is open, the hiring manager and the recruiter have to sit down and actually go through a checklist of things that need to be defined. One of those is the interview plan, one of those is a scorecard, and we also draft a job description. The second solution is similar. Again, it's tough love. Set SLAs, and SLAs stand for service level agreements. If these SLAs aren't met, no more candidates. And this is as simple as saying to your hiring manager, I expect you to give me feedback within 2 days. 10 days is a lot, excuse me, within 2 days. And if the hiring manager doesn't meet that SLA, don't send them any more candidates. The third one, I think we've all probably tried this one before. This is be a squeaky wheel, right? Squeaky wheels get the oil. One of the things I did at my old job is I would actually take my laptop and sit at an engineer's desk or a hiring manager's desk while they were in a meeting, and I'd work at their desk until I got out of the meeting, and this made sure that they couldn't start answering emails or go to another meeting without talking to me. It was disconcerting the first couple times I did this for the engineers, but ultimately it worked and they paid more attention to recruiting. The next one is set a regular communication cadence. Make sure you're informing your hiring managers often about what's going on so they can prioritize. Related point, provide information, show how important hiring is. And the last point is always be prepared. Hiring managers like to do desk drive-bys, and one of the things that can help them prioritize is making sure you can tell them where candidates are in the pipeline. And Dina, before we move on to problem number 2, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Caitlin, I think the only thing I would add, because I think you hit on all the topics, is one thing I'll do sometimes with managers is ask them what is not getting done or how their lives would be easier if this person was hired on. And there's something about personalizing that question that really sort of sparks a fire within that manager, and they start looking at it through sort of a different lens. So that's one other solution or sort of tactic that I might sort of add on to the list here.
Great idea. All right, so problem number 2. Problem number 2, hiring managers don't know what they're looking for. And you can see this when hiring managers say, we only hire the best people. Or, I want to hire a VP of sales, but I only want to pay this person $100,000. The last point is, I need a senior MySQL engineer who can code MySQL, Java, and also knows JavaScript. I actually worked on a role that was that exact same profile, and I can tell you that person does not exist except in Arizona. So some solutions to this problem. So number 1, define what the best people actually means. It's a really easy thing to say, but if your hiring manager can't tell you what that looks like, you have no idea how to provide candidates that meet that bar. And I mentioned this as a solution to problem 1, but those official kickoff meetings can really help. This will help you identify problem areas like that VP of sales, so we only can afford to pay $100,000. This helps you identify that and talk about it before you go out and start talking to candidates. And this next bullet point, describe the knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, that someone needs to do in order to do the job. Don't describe the person. That's not really helpful. This is perhaps my favorite question ever, but ask why. If your hiring manager tells you they need someone with 8 years of marketing experience, ask them why that's going to solve the problem for them. And then define the day 1 problem. What problem is your hiring manager trying to solve today by hiring this person? That can actually help you identify the scorecard, the skills and abilities that the person needs to have. And then this next bullet point, provide market information. So in that second example where I talked about the VP of sales and only $100,000, that person doesn't exist, and the compensation band for a VP of sales is much higher. It's your responsibility as a recruiter to actually provide that information to the hiring manager and educate them. And this last point, reevaluate your job search often, right? If a role's been open for a couple weeks and you haven't seen candidates come in, talk to your hiring manager about it and make sure that you're actually looking for the right person. Dina, do you have anything to add?
No, I think these are all perfect and dead on.
Great. All right, so moving on to problem number 3. Hiring managers don't know how to prepare and coach their interview team. And you can see this when the interviewers say, well, I don't know how to evaluate this candidate because I don't know anything about the role. Your interviewer might say, why do I need to provide feedback? We're not hiring the guy anyway. And my favorite, wait, I have an interview today. This is where your interviewer forgot they had an interview completely. So how do you help the hiring manager here? Well, the first point is show your hiring manager that ineffective interviews waste the interviewer's time. And time equals money. And you can especially see this with sales, right? If your sales executives are spending an hour on the phone interviewing people, that's an hour where they're not closing deals. And that's potentially lost revenue for your company. Second bullet point, take the onus of interviewing off your hiring manager and train the interviewers yourself. Recruiters are really good at interviewing, or at least I hope we are, and we're often the best people who can help train the interviewers. Bullet 3, remind the interviewers often. Greenhouse actually has a great feature where we remind people and send them emails automatically the day of interviews. I'm not great at reading emails, and so I actually would like additional reminders, and I think the interviewers do appreciate it when you stop by and remind them that they have interviews. Next bullet point, run postmortems and feedback roundtables. So actually sit down and talk about feedback after it's been given. When a search closes or if a search hasn't been going really well, run postmortems and talk about how the search went. This last bullet point is related, but value and acknowledge your interviewer's opinions. If people are spending 15 minutes filling out a scorecard or writing down feedback, that's 15 minutes of their time that they can't spend doing their other jobs. And if they're writing great feedback, tell them that. Dina, what do you think? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is probably just adding on to the point of training the interviewers yourself. So one thing that we've done as a recruiting team at Glassdoor is really taking the ownership here and helping the manager to create questions and topics for the interview panel to cover. And this certainly can be a bit time consuming on the front end, but it makes the process move so much more quickly and also efficiently on the back end. And an added bonus is that you might even create a repeatable process for the future. And it also creates a really good candidate experience and showcases that you're prepared and you're organized as an organization. And not to mention, you're going to learn so much more about the candidates during the process and likely make a better hire.
That's a great point. Right, problem number 4. Hiring managers don't know how to budget time for recruiting. This is sort of related to our first problem, but I wanted to touch on it in more detail. So some common behavior, and both of these examples apply to engineering, but it could really go to apply to any other team, sales, account management. But one thing I've heard before is we're going to miss our sprint goals this month if we take this much time to interview. The second point, my engineers are complaining that they need to stay late to finish their feedback forms. And so some solutions to this. So number one, automate the interview process as much as possible. One of the things that's very helpful with engineering is using some tools like CoderPad or HackerRank, which actually test the technical skills of candidates before they get to the engineers, right? This is an additional bar that each candidate needs to meet before they start talking to your team. And then the second point is related, train the recruiting team to assess the technical stuff. At Conductor, what was really helpful, my old company, the engineers gave me a couple of very basic questions to ask technical candidates, and I would ask those and assess and write down the answers verbatim and then give it to the engineers. And if the engineer that I was interviewing didn't answer the question correctly, we didn't pass them on. The next point, this one's a little bit more difficult, and it's one I haven't been successful at actually implementing myself, but I've heard from other recruiters that this is a good way to make sure teams are prioritizing interviews. But build interview time into project deadlines. So it's really easy for us as recruiters to estimate how much time someone will spend in an interview each week, right? So let's say it's about 4 hours per week. That 4 hours is 4 hours of lost time that engineer can't commit to a sprint. So actually build that lost time into the sprint deadline. This last bullet point is somewhat related, but budget time for feedback. Something that's really helpful is actually building in 15 minutes at the end of an interview so that no one else can put a meeting on that engineer's or interviewer's calendar, and they have time to sit down and write their feedback.
Hey, Caitlin, this is Katie. We just had a question come in asking about sprints and sprint goals. Do you mind really quickly explaining what those are?
Absolutely. So sprint is let's see, I think some of the Journey House engineers are on the line, so hopefully I don't butcher this, but a sprint is how an engineering team actually creates a project deadline for releasing a feature. You'll hear it often in teams that use an agile engineering process. So the idea is you start a feature, so you start the sprint, and then at the end of the sprint, that's when the feature is released. And it's just a way that agile engineering teams talk about project deadlines.
Great, thank you.
All right, and Tina, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add here is, I think similar to you, Caitlin, I love the idea of building recruiting into the project deadlines for the team. Again, something I haven't done, but something that I will sort of start to utilize. So I think that this really makes it digestible and also realistic, especially for engineering and dev teams, and kind of puts things into their common terms. And then one thing that we have done at Glassdoor, and I've even done at previous employers, is asking managers to block out specific times each week for interviews. So it's carved out on their schedule, and the recruiters know that they can utilize those blocks each week for recruiting. And even if you don't fill them up, then the manager gets time back. But it's also just a great way where when you're on the phone with a great candidate, you can just quickly know that you have that time and the manager's attention from that particular block.
That's a great idea. All right. So the last problem that I'm going to talk about before turning it over to Dina is the problem where hiring managers rely solely on us, recruiting, to find candidates. So some examples here are, I only want to interview people who are late stage, right? Second example, why do I need to ask my team for referrals? Isn't that your job? This last one is a little harsh, but the hiring manager might say, if I was supposed to hire people, you, the recruiter, wouldn't be here. So some solutions to this. Be honest and upfront with your hiring managers and tell them what you can or can't do, right? And one of the things that I'm not great at is coding. My intro says I tried and failed to learn how to code. And one of the things I can't do is really deeply assess technical skill. I can do it on a very baseline standpoint, but any further down, I can't do it. And I'm upfront about that. Second thing you can do is push back on your hiring managers. Recruiting is a reciprocal process. And these next two bullet points are actually related to this one. So one of the ways you can demonstrate to hiring managers that recruiting is reciprocal is actually get their help with prospecting. And just in case we all have the same definition of prospecting, prospecting to me is when we're doing outreach to those passive candidates, so people who haven't applied and they're actually happily employed. And I've found that emails from my hiring managers get a much higher level of response than emails from me. And I take that data and I show them. And one of the things that can get your hiring managers interested in prospecting is actually writing out templates for them, writing out the email that they're going to send to the prospect, and then passing it off to the hiring manager. And the next point is get your hiring managers help with referrals. Again, with their team, it's much better to have the hiring manager ask for referrals and remind their team than to hear it from recruiting, right? I think hiring managers, their direct reports, pay much more attention to their manager than they do to me. And referrals are a really helpful way to build that reciprocal relationship. And then the last one, I've talked about this before, but provide tough love when needed. And this is where if your hiring manager isn't working with you on a role, you actually shut down the requisition. Use this sparingly. This is a little bit dangerous because this can make your hiring manager, rightly so, a little bit irritated with you if you turn off their candidate flow. But one of the things that can be helpful is to say, look, we've interviewed this many people, and it's taking this long to get the candidates through the pipeline. We're losing people because we're taking too long to interview them. So until you have time to prioritize this, hiring manager, we're going to shut the role down. That's that tough love thing. And Dina, before we go on to your problems, do you have anything to add to that last slide?
No, I don't think so. I think those are all great. And definitely, I love that last point of the tough love, sort of pulling the rack or sort of rejecting a candidate. And again, I've had to sort of use that a couple times in my career, and it certainly does sort of light a fire.
Great. All right, and over to you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so kicking off problem number 6 and the back half of our top 10 here, we've got hiring managers don't provide timely feedback to recruiting. So some things you might hear. I don't have time to write feedback. I don't have time to meet about them. Just bring in the next one. Or it's too cumbersome to leave feedback. So some solutions to these problems are, 1, make feedback easy to give. If it's not a chore and a task that hiring managers dread, they might be more willing to do it. So one specific example at Glassdoor, what we've done is we've instituted a simple thumbs up, thumbs down, or middle of the road rating system, and then added in an additional standard 3 questions to evaluate depending on the skill set. And if the interviewer wants to add in additional text, that's great. We kind of keep an open box for that. But at least it keeps consistency and also allows the recruiter the core information necessary to know how to quickly move forward with candidates. Secondly, set up a weekly debrief meeting. And Caitlin talked a bit about this earlier as well. And if hiring managers are completely adverse to leaving feedback in the ATS, or maybe your ATS is too clunky and it makes it too difficult for them, it's a really good idea to have a weekly recruiting debrief meeting where you can look through all the candidates in the mix, talk about folks who have interviewed in the past that are still in the pipeline, who you want to move forward with, or even who to cut loose. This definitely isn't ideal because you want to have the feedback in your ATS, but at least the recruiter can potentially add in a quick note on behalf of the managers and also know how to close out candidates and keep them moving forward. And then last, go straight to the top. You definitely need an advocate, and who better to be that person than the head of the department that you're recruiting for. Generally, these folks understand the importance of recruiting, and they'll be willing to request or require this of their team. Caitlin, anything you would add here?
No, those are all great points.
Okay, wonderful. So moving on to problem 7, which is hiring managers become unresponsive. You may hear things like, I'm super busy, and I don't have the time to recruit. Or perhaps you hear nothing at all. They're unresponsive. And last, my actual job is more important than dealing with this. Isn't this your job? That might be my favorite thus far. So some of the solutions here. 1, be persistent. Get an answer from whoever will respond to you. Unresponsiveness is unfortunately a normal part of our world as recruiters. So the key here is, why are they being responsive? You need to get to the bottom of this. Is it perhaps the position is no longer a priority? Has it been put on hold? Are they maybe promoting someone internally? There are definitely a number of reasons behind unresponsiveness, but regardless, you need to get an answer. And in today's competitive recruiting landscape, giving the excuse to execs as a recruiter that the hiring manager is unresponsive is just unfortunately not unacceptable. So you need to get an answer from someone, and how do you do this? One, get their attention. Text, email, voicemails, chat, or the good old standby, simply drop by their office, or in Caitlin's case, sit at their desk, which I absolutely love. Find a time on their calendar that's open, drop by and just set up a quick 10-minute catch-up session, or maybe try and understand sort of their hours in the office. So do they arrive early or do they work late? Oftentimes, these are the best times to grab some valuable information from somebody and really use it to your advantage. But I think we also talked about this earlier. If you're going to get some time with them, make sure you come prepared and know exactly what questions you need answered in order to move forward. Be succinct, and by showing that you understand that their time is valuable, you'll be building trust and rapport. And lastly, if necessary, use your manager to your advantage. That is what they are there for. And ultimately, if it gets you an answer and allows you to not miss your hiring goals, it's a win-win for everybody. Caitlin, anything you'd like to add in?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I have to add, Dina, is what I've done in the past. This is another one of those tough love situations. Is if I haven't received a response from a hiring manager within a certain time period, and usually it's about 5 days, I'll actively regret or reject the candidate. And a couple reasons for that. I mean, number one, with engineers, if you wait a long time, 5 days, or actually even more than 2 days to get back to an engineering candidate, they often have an offer from another company, and I track that data. The other thing is candidate experience. It really stinks if you're a candidate and you don't hear back from a company for 5 days in a row, right? They just interviewed with you. They're really nervous. They're really excited about whether they got the position. And if your hiring manager isn't going to respect that, then proactively regret the candidate. Send them a nice note and tell the hiring manager that you did that. Word of caution, I would do that very sparingly, because if you do it often, your hiring managers will get mad at you. But every now and then, it can be a really good way to get them to pay more attention to the role.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so moving on to problem number 8. Hiring managers panic if they don't get a ton of applications in the first few days a job is open. So we certainly see this often from more junior managers. So things like, there aren't enough people applying to my post. Where are we promoting this job? I need this to be front and center. Or lastly, what's wrong with the post? I think I need you to change the description. So some solutions here are, one, assess the advertising channels. Perhaps there's niche job boards where they could post, use tools like Glassdoor for display advertising. And secondly, also you'll want to, kind of goes hand in hand, assess the competition. What are they calling this role? Are you using the latest hot vernacular? In today's fast-changing environment, what was the norm yesterday could very well be old news today, and you'll want to make sure that your job is updated to that. Third, you're going to want to assess the description and the job title. So are you maximizing SEO? Is the description written in your company's brand and voice? Or is it just like every other description out there and thus not really standing out from the crowd? Fourth, you'll want to discuss with the hiring manager the normal timelines or expected timelines for sourcing. Communicate your strategy and your approach. Make sure that your sourcing is visible to them so they can actually see the daily and weekly activity that you're doing and not thinking that their rec has just gone into a black hole. Over-communication is really important for this piece. And another good idea is to sort of set realistic response rates to sourcing. So generally, data will show you that around 15 to 20%, 20% is pretty high actually, of passive candidates will respond to reach out from a recruiter. So if you're reaching out to, say, 20 people in the first few days of the search, the expectation or the data is going to show that only 3, maybe 4 of those folks will actually respond to you, and there's no guarantee that they'll be qualified or even interested in the role. So last solution, again, kind of goes hand in hand with sourcing, is you're going to want to explain to the manager that you need to woo them, and that candidates and the best candidates aren't just waiting around for your company to post a job. So the best thing to do is educate your manager on these trends, and always remember that you are the expert in this area. Caitlin, is there anything that I missed here?
No, the only thing I would add, Dina, is just the value of historical data. If you can pull where your existing employees have come from, and even if you're 10 people, it's valuable information to have. My guess is most of your existing employee base will be from referrals or prospective candidates. And take that data and show your hiring manager and say, look, this is why sourcing is so important for us to do, because very few of the people we eventually hire come from direct applications. And that's a good way for you to get them to really pay attention to sourcing and get them involved in it.
That's great. I love that. And certainly we love data, and I think hiring managers especially are loving data, so that would be a great thing to sort of pool and give to them for some visibility. Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on to problem number 9. The hiring manager wants the dreaded purple squirrel. So things that you may see here are, I need the best candidates in the door. Why do I need to ask my team for referrals? Isn't that your job? Or, if I'm supposed to hire people, you wouldn't be here. So some solutions to this more ornery hiring manager. So first thing, set up some time to source together. And Caitlin, I think you referenced this earlier on, but if you can show the hiring manager that perfection isn't something that grows on trees, they'll likely be more willing to be lenient with some of the criteria. Secondly, discuss the top performers on their team. If they were all purple squirrels, then maybe you can find that person. But likely they were candidates with just core skills and maybe a bunch of intangibles such as willingness to learn or hunger for advancement. And while those technical skills can be learned, if a candidate has the right attitude, that is harder to come by. Third, start the interviewing process. Sometimes the best thing to do with a difficult hiring manager is have them speak with a few candidates, and perhaps they then can become either intrigued enough to want to pursue one of these candidates with lower expectations or criteria, or at least they'll be able to better be able to communicate to you what they're looking for. I would also sort of caution on this one because you're not going to spend too much time teeing up candidates that perhaps are going to be a waste, but at least you're doing something rather than just being paralyzed by the search and providing no one. And then you're educating the hiring manager around the market and also perhaps winning yourself some flexibility in the search. Fourth, you're going to want to get to the bottom of why they need this purple squirrel. Is it due to weaknesses on their team, perhaps maybe even their own insecurities as a leader? Are they overwhelmed? Is this their first time recruiting? Maybe this is what their manager told them to find, but they actually disagree, and so you've got sort of 2 hiring managers that you're dealing with. If you can get to the root cause and the drivers behind the stringency of the search, there may actually be an aha moment for you and that manager. And then last here, have the hiring manager stack rank out the skills that they're desiring for the rec. This will allow you as a recruiter to understand the 3 must-haves for the role, and finding 3 things is significantly easier in a candidate versus trying to find, say, 10. And then this also will give you a fighting chance to find the right candidate and understand where you potentially make trade-offs with those skill sets. Caitlin, anything you might want to add to this?
No, that was great. Agree with everything.
All right, perfect. Okay, so 10, our last hiring manager roadblock. Hiring managers don't see the value in weekly updates or meetings and calls. So things like, I can't have a standing meeting to deal with this, or I'm just too busy. So some solutions here would maybe be first to ask if the search could be delegated to someone else on their team. Maybe there's somebody on the team that is an emerging leader, And this way you get sort of a two-for solution here, because it's a great development opportunity for the delegated person to take on some recruiting tasks, but also this takes something off of the hiring manager's plate. Let the hiring manager know you'll work closely with this person and then present them with the top 3 candidates. Secondly, join the hiring manager's weekly team meeting. Generally, hiring managers or managers in general will have a weekly team meeting. And if you can just sort of join, say, for the first 5 minutes and address recruiting, one, you'll be able to get everybody who's probably decision-making on the role in one place. You can ask for referrals while you're there, but it also really sort of solidifies your relationship with that hiring team and has you viewed as their partner and also a valuable extension of the business. And last, is there alternative ways that you could communicate to maybe make the hiring manager be a bit more responsive? So tools like Slack or Google Docs, if necessary, do they not want phone calls? Do they want email? What is their preferred method? So once you know that, you might be able to then get the hiring manager to commit to a solution, and that way you can consolidate all of your updates into weekly emails, docs, whatever it might be, and then quickly highlight the action items that you need from that hiring manager. So one, it's not a huge time suck for them, but two, they know 1, 2, 3, boom, this is what I need to do so that this recruiter can move forward and find me that great candidate. Caitlin, anything you'd like to add on this last point?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on your first point, which is awesome, is can the search be delegated? And that's actually something that I've done a couple times here at Greenhouse. We have a lot of roles open right now, and I have a team of 4 people, including myself. And what we've done is we've delegated a couple of really key searches. One was for an office manager, and one is for a sales engineer. And this did a couple things. It definitely provided a development opportunity, like you said, Dina. In both cases, Will, our account manager, he's a recruiter, but he's also relearning some of the recruiting skills, and he can translate that to our clients. And then Nanan, one of our strategy consultants, he is learning how to recruit, so he, again, can translate those skills down to clients. The other thing this helped do was it helped make the hiring managers feel like work was being done on their roles. They definitely got a lot more attention from Will and Nanan than they would have from me, just because I'm spread so thin. So I really love that idea. I think it's very effective.
That's awesome. Thank you. I love kind of those real-life sort of success stories, so thank you for sharing.
Great, and so just to sort of tie things up here and start talking about our conclusion and ultimate solutions, but one of the things that Dina and I touched on and talked about but didn't really nail down is the #1 most important thing you can do to get your hiring managers on board. And that is to get your executive team on board. If your CEOs aren't, or your C-levels aren't talking about recruiting in every single meeting that they're having with their hiring managers, if they're not talking about it in all-hands meetings, if they're not talking about it in employee newsletters, then hiring managers don't think that recruiting is important. So make sure your CEO is the one who's communicating this to your hiring managers, not just you. And you also need to make sure you hold your CEO accountable when you're hiring for him or her, and treat them the same that you would as any other hiring manager. And so just to tie everything together here, earlier in the presentation, we referenced the idea of creating alignment, and you create alignment in partnerships with your hiring managers by creating trust, communicating often, and educating each other. So in the next couple minutes, we're just going to touch on each of these points and talk through how all the solutions we mentioned earlier can help with all of these. And so the first one is communication. It's really important to communicate with your hiring manager and encourage them to communicate with you. One of the ways you do this is by proactively providing information. Don't just wait for those desk drive-bys. We talked a lot about the value of data during this webinar. Send weekly emails. Tell them where their candidates are ending up stagnant. Walk them through bottlenecks. Really proactively provide that information, and don't wait for your hiring managers to come to you. The next point is meetings, and I put an exclamation point here because meetings often get a bad rap for wasting time. Don't let that happen to you. If you are putting time on your hiring manager's calendar, make sure that meeting has intent and purpose, and you go with a goal, and you actually talk through how you're going to reach that goal in that meeting. We talked a couple times about the value of postmortems as a way to identify bottlenecks, which is my next point, and really use postmortems and these bottleneck conversations to decide how to solve these problems together with your hiring manager. Dina, do you have anything to add before we move on?
No, I think those are all great.
Perfect.
All right, so I guess we will transition over to the second point, which is trust. And Caitlin touched a bit on this, but trust is certainly a key component to the success with your hiring manager. So a few things to sort of tie things off here. Be honest if you're going to miss a deadline. So when building trust, honesty really goes a long way. And we're all human, so communicate if you've missed a deadline. And certainly don't make this a habit, but everyone misses every once in a while. And as long as you're communicating and being honest about those things, certainly that can be forgiven. Secondly, explain your expectations. So this is a relationship, the hiring manager and the recruiter. And if you're able to set clear expectations for each party, you can make sure that you're on the same page and also won't have higher or lower expectations from the other and really save a lot of grief in the recruitment process in the long run. And then lastly, you're going to want to hold each other accountable, so tying back into those expectations. Recruiting is this relationship, and when all parties are held accountable for their deliverables, you'll ultimately reach success and hire the best candidates.
Great. And so our last point before we open it up to questions is, remember, part of creating this partnership with your hiring manager is to understand and educate. And there's a couple ways you can do that. So first, participate in the team onboarding process, One thing I've done with the recruiters here at Greenhouse is the engineers here have been nice enough to run them through the engineering onboarding process. A lot of that is over our heads because we're not engineers, but it's a really helpful way for the recruiters to learn the technical terms we need to be looking for. And we can also talk about how Greenhouse is built and use that to educate our candidates. Second point is related. Go to stand-up. And this isn't just related to engineering. This can also apply to sales meetings. So engineers here have a daily stand-up at 11:45, and we don't always attend, but sometimes we do, and we talk about how recruiting is going. The other thing we can do is attend monthly sales meetings, and this helps us learn a little bit about the priorities on each team and how they talk to each other. The next point is train your interviewers. Again, this helps to take the onus off of your hiring manager. If you train your interviewers, you're educating them about how to be better interviewers. And interviewers really like to learn how to do this, and they want to make sure they're doing a good job. And the last point is open source your recruiting meetings. There's going to be some meetings that recruiting has that you can't open source, right? So the meetings where I talk with my team about compensation or visa status or things like that, like those shouldn't be open sourced. But meetings where we prioritize hiring or where we talk about the different long-term projects we're working on, we should absolutely invite other teams to attend those. And one of the things we recently started doing here is sourcing jams. So every Tuesday we sit for 3 hours in a room and we invite other teams to attend, and they get a chance to actually see how we do recruiting. And they really like learning about that. Dina, do you have anything to add?
I think the only thing I would sort of tack on is, I love that you've sort of coined it as sourcing jams. We do something similar at Glassdoor. We don't have quite as catchy of a title, but we'll do the same thing when there's positions that are sort of being elusive to the recruiter and we've sort of maxed out on sourcing. We'll get a bunch of folks from the team into a room and almost have sort of like a contest, and we'll have everyone from recruiting attend for an hour and then have sort of the key interview panel for that position, so the hiring manager and maybe a couple of their direct reports, and we'll just start hammering on the sourcing, create sort of a Google Doc so the manager can look at that, or the recruiter can go back and sort of see who the best candidates are. And we've even sort of had prizes around things like who adds in the most names, who puts in the best 1 or 2 candidates. And it's great because, one, everyone is getting involved, so you get a bunch of different creative approaches, but also you've got the hiring manager there right at that time, so if you've got just on-the-fly questions, you can ask them.
That's a great idea. I haven't tried the prize idea yet. I think that's something I'll try to do here. Awesome. And so that's the end of the presentation. Katie, do we have time to run up through some questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you guys very much. Great presentation. We have a lot of questions, so we will start going through those right now. So, Caitlin, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned skills assessments. A few questions came in on what tools you use to do skill assessments.
Well, this is going to be a shameless plug for Greenhouse, but I use Greenhouse at Greenhouse. So we have scorecards that are pre-built, and they're actually very similar to the system that Dina described with the thumbs up and the thumbs down. But what we do is we outline the technical skills. We have sort of a common core, so personal skills we look for, and soft skills we look for, and we define that all in Greenhouse before the job goes live. If you don't have Greenhouse, one thing I've done in the past is I've actually created a skills matrix, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet that I pass around to the hiring managers, and I say, what do you think we need for this type of job, and what do you think is basic level, and what do you think is advanced level? And by walking them through how to define those, we create a really good scorecard for how to evaluate candidates. So I've used Greenhouse in the past, I use Greenhouse here, but the Excel spreadsheet matrix is also very helpful.
Okay, great. I have another question here. What if a hiring manager cancels the interview when the candidate arrives and says to reschedule? Has that happened to either of you, and if so, do you have any ways to combat that?
Sure, yeah, I can take that one. So yes, it's happened probably more times than I would care to remember or speak about. And so I think that this probably goes back to maybe potentially adding in into your sort of initial intake meeting things around who else could do initial screens or who could this be delegated to. You absolutely need to have them speak with someone. So certainly as a recruiter, you spend some time with them, potentially give them a tour, make sure that the time is still valuable, but find someone from that team. Even if it's the newbie person who started 2 weeks beforehand, that's still a really interesting perspective for someone. So that's what we've done. I've seen happen at sort of Glassdoor when an exec gets pulled out of a process. We do have to scramble, and it can be last minute, but you need to kind of find someone who can sort of step in at that time. If all else fails and you have no one, it certainly does not make for a great candidate experience, but make sure that you, at least as a recruiter, clear your schedule and are able to spend some good time with that person and answer any questions maybe that they had prepared, or just so that you, again, are trying to not waste their time.
Okay, great. I have another question here. There's a few questions on this. What if the head of your department or even your C level are the non-responsive individuals?
Oh, that's where I love the tough love situation. If they're unresponsive, don't work on the role. Give your time to the people who are responsive. And it's not a great solution because ultimately you have a really unhappy hiring manager, but you need to fill roles. And if your hiring managers aren't going to pay attention to it, then fill roles where you can and demonstrate that recruiting works if the hiring manager is responsive.
Okay, great. Here's another question. If you know your hiring manager won't pay a salary for a certain position, how do you convince them to either up the salary or lower it to their standards? Do you guys have any ideas on that?
Yeah, Definitely. So I think it's kind of twofold here. A lot of times what I've done in the past is bring forward candidates that are within the price range, and if that person does lack some of the skills, at least they understand what that salary will buy them in the market. And then secondly, if I find that kind of just dream candidate that is a higher salary, I still make sure to, and I will communicate to the candidate, hey, your salary is a bit above budget, but I think it's worth getting you connected to the manager either for future pipelining or just to kind of, have them see sort of what you could bring to the table. And then I'll ask the manager to do just even a 30-minute phone screen, because if they are able to, potentially fall in love with this candidate and think that they are the one, then they will be willing to fight the battle of potentially getting more budget or sort of being on the same page as you and seeing that the salary is off market. So definitely you want to present both types of candidates, because if you don't have an example, then the data you might be putting forward to them isn't going to mean anything unless they can actually see that physically in a potential hire.
Okay, that's good. What are your tips on getting hiring managers involved in sourcing? Do either of you have tips on that?
One thing, this is Caitlin, one thing that I've found helpful is if you can't get them to source, or if you want to even just introduce the idea of sourcing to them, do it in that first kickoff meeting and talk about it. Hiring managers are really, they're able to say who they think is really good, right? So if you say, well, who do you think would be good for this VP of sales role, right? My CEO, Daniel, could come up with like 5 people in about 6 minutes of a LinkedIn search, right? And you might not, as a recruiter, get those people, but at least now you have a good idea of the target profile, and you've also kind of planted the idea of sourcing in your hiring manager's mind. So follow up with them and say, hey, you like these 6 people. I wrote an email, and I found their email addresses through internet searches. I'd like you to go out and actually email all of them and see if you get a response. So do the work for them and kind of sneakily get them to start sourcing even if they don't think they are.
Okay, great. And this, I'm not sure if you guys will be able to give a concrete answer, but how do you kind of develop a timeline for hiring? Obviously, they differ from position to position, but what's a typical timeline to fill a position?
Yeah, so this is Dina, and this is really where you kind of have to have some kind of historical data. If you're, say, new to the organization and you don't have this, and hopefully you have it maybe even from previous organizations. So a pretty common metric to track is time to fill, and it will certainly vary depending on the skill set, the level, department, but I know this is something that we track at Glassdoor and pretty much every organization I've ever worked at, because it's a pretty easy metric to track. And so, for example, we know that in sales, it takes about, or at least in 2014, it took about 40 days to hire a salesperson. Certainly for, say, our SMB market, it was shorter, and for enterprise, a little bit longer, but on average. And so every time you're able to go into a search, certainly if you're working with the same managers, they may know this, but if it's a new manager, you can say, okay, so typically this is about the life cycle of a search. And then certainly with development, I think average is somewhere around, 60 days. So there are different sort of expectations for each, but if you're not tracking that metric, I would say that's probably, core 1 or 2 things that you should be tracking, so you can really set those realistic expectations with each and every sort of kickoff sessions or new rec.
Okay, great. There's another question that's asking, do you see any changes in this entire methodology for high volume hiring situations greater than 30 requisitions at a time with multiple hiring managers? Do you have ideas for that?
Katie, can you repeat or rephrase that question a little bit? I'm not entirely sure what's being asked.
Yeah, sorry. This person is saying this is good, but it seems more applicable for low volume hiring. And they were just wondering if you have high volume hiring, more than 30 requisitions at a time, do you have any advice for them? Does that make sense?
It does. Let me see if I can answer it. And maybe my definition of high volume recruiting is a little bit different than the person on the phone. My high volume recruiting is where I have one role, but it's an entry level position, so I tend to get more applications, and we're also trying to fill multiple spots. You have to treat it the same way as any other job you're working on. And your hiring manager, yes, they're getting a lot more active applicants, but if they're not prioritizing it and paying attention to those candidates are going to go away. And then if high volume is when one recruiter has multiple roles to fill, this is really where you try to offload some of the recruiting work onto your hiring managers. Hiring managers didn't open a role for no reason. I mean, they need this person on board. And so getting their help and saying, you know, hey, I have 30 recs to fill. There's not enough hours in the day for me to be able to interview all these people. What do you feel about me maybe adding 2 interviews a day to your schedule? Most hiring managers, not all of them, but most of them are going to say, oh yeah, absolutely. Like, I really want to get this role filled. Like, load up my calendar. Just have that conversation with them ahead of time and set those expectations about what you can physically do with the hours in the day.
Okay, great. And it looks like we only have time for a few more questions, but here's another one. Any idea on senior level hiring when you have multiple people managing the final decision and they may not agree?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, what I would say there is you have to get them all on the same page. And a lot of times what I've done, because certainly the more high level the position is, the more scrutiny it's certainly going to come under. And the hiring team is probably also significantly more picky in that search. So what I've found is if it seems like half the interview panel is agreeing, half is disagreeing on multiple candidates, it's you have to get everybody into the room together. So even if that's 15 minutes, you work with their executive admins, get everyone together from that exec team, walk through the priorities, why maybe they're disqualifying candidates, what they're really looking for, because if they can hear each other talk, one, they may align with what one of the other hiring managers or one of the other team members is thinking or how they've been judging candidates, versus if you're just putting feedback into an ATS, then no one's really calling them on it and they're not discussing. So you have to get them, and even if you can't get them all into the same room, then start an email thread. Do something so that they are all seeing each other's feedback. Maybe even copy and paste some of the feedback from the ATS into an email so they can sort of see it firsthand. But communication is absolutely going to be key to that team's success.
Okay, great. Another question here. What are your thoughts on trying to get your CEO more on board with recruiting? Ours currently has a ton of meetings, and it's difficult to get them on schedule. Do you have any advice?
I think, well, Dina's suggestion about blocking out time ahead of time for your CEO, I think that's a really good idea. I mean, making sure that recruiting is forefront of their mind, send them emails once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. Like, recruiting is ultimately their job. They need to hire their team as a CEO. I think too often CEOs forget that. Understandably, they're very busy. So just work with your CEO to figure out how you can help him or her prioritize. And if it means you set aside 3 hours on a Friday afternoon when that person can't take any calls or meetings, do that and really push them and say, you're the person who is I always get this word mixed up, I think it's the paragon of recruiting in your company. They need to act like that because the hiring managers are going to take direction from the CEO.
Great. Okay, thanks everybody. It looks like we have run out of time. We still have a few questions, but feel free to email your questions to my email is katie.williams@glassdoor.com. I'll put it in the chat box so you can reach out to me and we can get those questions answered. And I'd really like to thank you all for taking the time out today to listen to our webinar. I hope you all enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Caitlin and Dina, for presenting. Everybody have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And just a reminder, we'll be sending out the presentation and the recording afterwards, so look out for that. Thank you all.